An Indianapolis woman tonight is arrested after police say her 2-year-old daughter was discovered with bruises on her body and a puncture wound on her neck. The little girl is identified as Skylar Gardner. Police say 33-year-old Chantel Gardner had called police saying she had found her daughter cold to the touch and underneath a dresser.
A 2-year-old girl left alone in a apartment, surrounded by and waste. No food, no warmth, no one to care for her. Her cries go unheard as her mother spends her nights elsewhere, chasing her dreams. Then one day, the unimaginable happens. When her mother returns, she finds Skylar unresponsive, cold to the touch. What the authorities uncover in the apartment raises serious questions about the safety of children in seemingly ordinary homes. How did things get so bad? The truth behind Skylar Gardner's life and death is more disturbing than you might expect. But before we begin, I just want to take a moment to thank you, my incredible viewers and subscribers. Your likes, shares, and thoughtful comments don't just support this channel. They help keep these stories alive. If you're new here, welcome. Be sure to hit that subscribe button and become part of this growing community that believes every story deserves to be told, and no victim should ever be forgotten. Skylar Gardner was a bright and lively child, born on August 21, 2022, who found joy in the little things. Her favorite pastime was watching Miss Rachel on YouTube, a show that kept her entertained and engaged. With her infectious smile and curiosity, Skylar's world was one of happiness and innocence. She had a special connection with her older siblings, spending most of her time with them, playing and comforting each other in their small world. Skylar was a happy child, but as time went on, her circumstances would begin to change.
On my home, like this money on my mind. The sight out of mind, but for me they don't apply. Only pressure. I look bitch that's better. So long I got my foot up on their necks, no I won't let.
Chantel Gardner, known by her stage name Channy B, had big dreams of making it as a rap star. While she juggled 2 jobs to make ends meet and raise her children, her aspirations of stardom began to consume her. Chantel's focus shifted more toward her career and personal goals, and slowly, the responsibilities of motherhood seemed to fall to the background. She became more invested in her music career, spending less time caring for Skylar and her sibling. The ambitions that once drove her to work hard began to overshadow her primary role as a mother, leaving her children to fend for themselves in increasingly neglected conditions. Skylar's father, who lived in Ohio, had limited involvement in his children's lives due to his disability. Though he wanted the best for them, he believed he could not provide the care they needed, and ultimately made the difficult decision to relinquish custody to Chantel. Despite this, he still tried to stay connected, reaching out through calls and video chats in hopes of maintaining a relationship. However, Chantel often ignored these attempts, widening the distance between them. While he had trusted that she would provide for their children, he had no way of knowing how far things would deteriorate. By October 2024, the cracks in Chantel Gardner's role as a mother had already begun to show. What started as brief moments away quickly escalated into something far worse. Initially, she would step out for short periods, meeting her boyfriend, Brian Thomas, in the parking lot, running errands or picking up food. At first, the absences may not have seemed alarming, but they quickly grew into a troubling pattern. As time passed, those short trips turned into longer absences. Hours became days. The apartment, once a home, began to reflect the growing neglect. Trash piled up. Food containers, fast food wrappers, and soiled diapers were left untouched. The air grew thick with the stench of filth, and yet Chantel seemed to care less and less. Instead of returning home, she chose to spend her nights at Brian's house, staying away for extended periods, sometimes up to 5 nights a week. During these absences, her children were left alone in the worsening conditions. When she did return, it was never for long. She would drop off food, often fast food, cheeseburgers, nuggets, or bags of chips, before leaving again. No effort was made to clean, no real care was given. The children were expected to fend for themselves, their world growing smaller and more unbearable with each passing day. While her children struggled in silence, Chantel's online presence painted a different picture. On social media, she was Channy B, a rising rapper chasing her dreams. She shared videos of herself in music studios, posed for pictures showing off her outfits, and posted about her aspirations. There were no mentions of Skylar or her sibling, no glimpses of the reality that unfolded behind closed doors. Instead, Chantel projected an image of success, freedom, and independence. She found time to promote her music and enjoy nights out, but none to ensure her children were safe, fed, or cared for. While she was out living the life she wanted, they were trapped in a home that was no longer a home, only an abandoned space where they waited, hoping their mother would come back. By the time January 2025 arrived, the conditions inside the apartment had deteriorated to a level no child should ever have to endure. The space was no longer just messy, it had become completely unlivable. But for Skylar and her sibling, this was their reality. On the afternoon of January 24th, around 4 p.m., Chantel Gardner made a brief stop at the apartment. She brought McDonald's Happy Meals for her children, handing them the food before quickly leaving again. It was the kind of visit they had grown used to, short, impersonal, and transactional. There were no hugs, no conversations, just food left behind as if it were enough to make up for her absence. She didn't stay to check on them. She didn't ask if they were okay. As soon as she placed the food down, she walked out the door and headed to her boyfriend, Brian Thomas's house, where she would remain for the rest of the night. That evening the apartment was eerily silent. No adults, no warmth. Just two small children left alone in a space that had long since stopped feeling like home. The furnace had stopped working some time ago, and without heat, the temperature inside the apartment steadily dropped. That night, it was especially cold. The lowest recorded indoor temperature was 46 degrees Fahrenheit, and the highest was 51 degrees, far too cold for a child as young as Skylar. Chantel was completely unaware of the suffering inside those walls, or better put, she completely neglected the suffering inside those walls. At Brian's house, she was warm, comfortable, and had everything she needed. Meanwhile, her children were left to fend for themselves in the freezing apartment, with only each other for comfort. On January 25th, Chantel finally returned to the apartment around 6:30 p.m. Like always, she called out to her children to come eat. But this time, only one child appeared. Confused, she looked around the room, expecting to hear Skylar's tiny footsteps following behind. But it never happened. So she began searching. Then she found her. Skylar was beneath a fallen dresser with canvas drawers, unresponsive and cold to the touch. The moment Chantel Gardner dialed 911, her voice was frantic. She told the dispatcher she had just found her daughter unresponsive beneath a fallen dresser. Her words were rushed, panicked. She claimed she had moved the dresser in an attempt to revive Skylar, but was unsuccessful. The urgency in her voice was undeniable, but the details were unclear. The dispatcher on the other end remained calm, guiding Chantel through the call while sending emergency responders to the apartment. Chantel continued to cry and scream for help, repeating that she didn't know what had happened. First responders arrived within minutes. As they stepped inside, they were immediately met with an overwhelming stench. The apartment was in disarray. Filth covered the floors, furniture and walls. The environment was nearly uninhabitable. They quickly turned their attention to Skylar. She was unresponsive, cold to the touch. There was nothing they could do. She was declared deceased on the scene. Nearby, her older sibling was found, alive but in a fragile state. The child showed clear signs of neglect, severe malnourishment, emotional distress. They were immediately taken to the hospital for evaluation. Medical staff would later confirm that, while not in immediate danger, their condition had been worsening over time.
Those new court documents say 2-year-old Skylar Gardner may have been dead for several hours before she was found, and her body was full of bruises and injuries.
As officers moved through the apartment, the reality of the situation became even more disturbing. The floors were layered with trash, rotting food, human waste, and sharp objects, including steak knives scattered within reach of the children. The home had no working heat. A bitter chill filled the air. Investigators took temperature readings and confirmed that the apartment ranged between 46 degrees Fahrenheit and 51 degrees Fahrenheit. Dangerously low, especially for young children. In every corner of the home there were signs of prolonged neglect. A crib, its mattress stained. Clothes mixed in with piles of garbage. Chicken bones left out. Open containers of fast food sauces, dried and crusted. The conditions weren't recent, they had been worsening for months. And then there was the dresser. It had fallen, just as Chantel described, but something about the scene didn't sit right with the investigators. The dresser wasn't heavy. It was a lightweight piece with canvas drawers, and it had landed partially against a chair. It didn't seem capable of causing serious harm, let alone taking a child's life. Something was missing. Something wasn't adding up. And as investigators looked deeper, they began to suspect that the truth of what had happened inside that apartment was far worse than anyone had initially realized. Skylar Gardner's autopsy painted a devastating picture of what she had endured in her final days. The official cause of death was hypothermia, a slow, painful decline, as her small body failed to withstand the freezing temperatures inside the apartment. Without warmth, without comfort, she had no way to fight the cold. But hypothermia was only part of the story. The medical examiner found signs of severe dehydration. Skylar had gone without enough fluids for far too long. Her body had struggled to function, her organs working harder in the absence of proper care. And then, the most heartbreaking discovery: foreign materials in her stomach and intestines, hair, feces, bits of paint chips. Skylar had been so desperate for food that she had resorted to eating whatever she could find around her. It was a chilling confirmation of just how neglected she had been. She hadn't just been left alone, she had been starving. Beyond the effects of malnutrition and exposure, Skylar's body bore the evidence of prolonged mistreatment. Bruises covered her small frame, including areas near her face and lower body. Investigators noted bite marks, some on her back, others beneath her arm. The wounds were examined closely, and the pattern suggested multiple instances of inflicted harm. Her inner lip showed signs of trauma, raising questions about what had truly happened behind closed doors. Her feet, too, bore injuries, consistent with exposure, neglect, and the harsh reality of surviving in an apartment that had been stripped of basic necessities. Perhaps the most disturbing discovery was the puncture wound on her neck. While it was determined to have occurred post-mortem, it was suspected to have been caused by rodents inside the apartment. It was a haunting detail, one that spoke to the squalid conditions Skylar had been left in. With these findings, investigators now had undeniable proof of just how much suffering had taken place. Skylar hadn't simply passed away in her sleep. She had endured unimaginable conditions, left cold, hungry, and unprotected. And now, the search for answers had only just begun. When investigators first questioned Chantel Gardner, she insisted she had been checking on her children daily. She claimed she was a struggling mother, doing her best to balance work, personal life, and parenthood. But as detectives pressed her for details, her story started to fall apart. At first, she said she had been with her children the night before Skylar's passing. But soon she admitted that the last time she had actually seen Skylar alive was on January 24th at around 4 p.m. She had stopped by the apartment just long enough to drop off McDonald's Happy Meals for her children before heading back to her boyfriend's house. She didn't stay. She didn't check on them. She left them behind, again. Investigators continued questioning her, and Chantel admitted to what they had already suspected. She had been leaving her children home alone for far longer than she initially claimed. What started as a few hours had turned into full nights, then multiple days at a time. The more the investigators uncovered, the clearer it became that this wasn't just a one-time mistake. It was a pattern of neglect, one that had been escalating for months. One of the most critical details in the investigation was the broken furnace. Chantel knew it wasn't working. She knew the apartment was freezing. But instead of reporting it to maintenance, she chose to stay silent. Why? Because she was afraid. Not afraid for her children's well-being, but afraid that someone would discover the truth, that her home had become unlivable, that her children were being left alone for days in filth and freezing temperatures. If maintenance workers had come inside, they would have seen everything: the trash piled up, the human waste on the floors, the food containers left to rot. And once they saw that, the authorities would have been involved. So Chantel made a decision. Instead of fixing the furnace, instead of ensuring her children had heat in the middle of winter, she ignored it. She left them in a freezing apartment while she stayed warm elsewhere. She also admitted that she had stopped bathing her children regularly. She rarely cleaned them, rarely changed their clothes, and left them in the same soiled diapers for extended periods. When questioned, she brushed it off, saying she would wipe them down occasionally and that Skylar got a bath once a week at most. Not because of hygiene, but simply to wash off the buildup of filth. Investigators noted that she had even stopped showering at the apartment herself, not because she lacked access to water, but because she couldn't stand the smell. Instead of cleaning, instead of fixing the problem, she chose the easy way out. She avoided her home entirely, leaving her children behind to suffer alone. With every confession, every detail that emerged, it became clear that this tragedy was not an accident. It was the direct result of months of neglect, a series of choices that had ultimately led to an outcome that could never be undone. When investigators turned their attention to Brian Thomas, Chantel Gardner's boyfriend, he claimed to be just as shocked as everyone else. He insisted that he had no idea about the conditions inside Chantel's apartment, or that the children had been left alone for extended periods. According to Brian, Chantel had always reassured him that her children were safe. When they weren't with her, she told him they were either at daycare or staying with friends and relatives. He claimed he had no reason to question her. After all, whenever he saw the children, they seemed fine. Brian also stated that he rarely, if ever, set foot inside Chantel's apartment. He claimed that the last time he had been inside was over a year ago. Whenever he picked her up, they met in the shared hallway, and she never invited him in. But as investigators dug deeper, his story started to fall apart. Brian may have wanted to distance himself from the situation, but the evidence suggested otherwise. For someone who spent so much time with Chantel, it seemed unlikely that he had no knowledge of what was happening. According to phone records, she spent as many as 5 nights a week at his house, and during those nights, her children were left completely alone. Investigators found it difficult to believe that he had never questioned where her children were staying, especially when they had only been seen in public on rare occasions. Additionally, messages recovered from Chantel's phone painted a different picture. There were conversations between them about her struggles, about the difficulty of raising 2 kids alone. Yet Brian never asked where they were, never insisted on seeing them. Even more concerning, some messages suggested that he had been inside the apartment after all. Despite his earlier claims, Brian admitted under further questioning that he had seen the children at least once in December, around his birthday. That meant that, at the very least, he had seen Skylar just weeks before her passing. With the conflicting accounts and his attempts to downplay his involvement, investigators determined that Brian had misled authorities in order to protect Chantel. Whether it was out of loyalty, fear, or self-preservation, his initial statements had delayed the investigation and concealed the truth. Brian Thomas had tried to paint himself as a bystander, someone who had nothing to do with the tragedy that had unfolded. But as more details came to light, it became clear, whether through neglect, silence, or willful ignorance, he had played a role in what happened. And now he would have to face the consequences. As the investigation unfolded, Chantel Gardner was taken into custody. Prosecutors charged her with neglect and criminal neglect, resulting in serious harm, offenses that carried severe penalties due to the extent of suffering her children endured. The evidence against her was overwhelming. She had left her children alone for days, neglected their basic needs, and allowed their living conditions to deteriorate beyond comprehension. Her actions, or rather, her inaction, had led to Skylar's tragic death. As news of the case spread, public outrage exploded. People couldn't understand how a mother could prioritize her personal life over the well-being of her own children. Social media was flooded with comments condemning Chantel's choices, and calls for the maximum sentence grew louder. What made it even more disturbing was her online presence. While Skylar and her siblings suffered, Chantel had been posting about her rap career, her nights out, and her aspirations, never once mentioning her children. The contrast between her online persona and the grim reality of her children's lives was too much for many to comprehend. The public wanted justice, not just for Skylar, but for the surviving sibling who had also endured unimaginable conditions. At first, Brian Thomas wasn't taken into custody. He wasn't Skylar's father. He hadn't been in the apartment when she passed. And yet, investigators weren't convinced of his innocence. He had spent nearly every night with Chantel while the children were alone. He had given contradictory statements to the police. He had claimed he never went inside her apartment, yet phone records and messages suggested otherwise. He had even admitted to seeing the children weeks before Skylar's passing. His lies and omissions had hindered the investigation, and law enforcement wasn't about to let that slide. A warrant was issued for Brian's arrest, charging him with aiding and abetting by deliberately misleading investigators. Though he hadn't directly harmed the children, his willingness to turn a blind eye and cover for Chantel had allowed the neglect to continue. Public reaction to Brian's role was mixed. Some saw him as just another man caught up in the wrong relationship, but others saw him as complicit, someone who could have stepped in but chose not to. For Skylar's biological father, the news was devastating. He had last seen his children on Thanksgiving of 2024, just 2 months before Skylar's life came to an end. He had trusted Chantel to provide a safe home for their children. He had believed that despite their separation, she would care for them properly. And while he had tried to stay connected through calls and video chats, his efforts were often ignored. Now he had to live with the heartbreaking reality that his daughter had suffered alone in a home that was supposed to protect her, that her last moments had been filled with cold, hunger, and neglect. His grief was immeasurable. He wasn't just mourning the loss of his daughter. He was mourning the lost chance to protect her. Skylar's case became a painful reminder of what happens when warning signs are ignored, when neglect is allowed to continue unchecked, and when the people meant to care for a child fail in the worst way possible. The legal process had begun, But for Skylar's father, and for everyone following the case, the real question remained: would justice truly be served? By April 2025, the legal system is preparing to bring Chantel Gardner to trial. Prosecutors are building a strong case, arguing that her consistent neglect and reckless disregard for her children's well-being directly led to Skylar's tragic passing. Neighbors who had heard the children crying at night began to question their own inaction. Friends who had been told the children were safe now realized they had accepted those reassurances too easily. The outrage wasn't just directed at Chantel and Brian. It was also a reflection on society as a whole. How did no one step in? How did so many people miss the signs? Skylar's story is not just a tragedy, it is a wake-up call. Too often, cases of neglect happen in silence. Many assume that if a child is in danger, someone must be watching out for them: a teacher, a social worker, a neighbor. But Skylar's case proves how wrong that assumption can be. A child's safety should never be taken for granted. Neglect is not always loud. It is often quiet, hidden behind closed doors, dismissed as someone else's problem. And that is why it is so important to pay attention. If you ever suspect a child is being neglected, don't ignore it. One phone call can save a life. One report can be the difference between life and death. There are far too many children suffering in silence, waiting for someone to notice, to step in, to help. Don't wait until it's too late. Be the voice for those who can't speak for themselves. Thank you for watching today's video. If this case moved you, please like, share, and subscribe. Stay aware, stay vigilant,